Susie and David, and the talk is entitled, as you know, and I'm calling it up, Friendship, Modernization, or Hegemony, exploring soft power design narratives and politics in the conversion of Tbilisi's Institute, Marx, Engels, and Lenin Building. And I want to just take a minute to introduce Susie and David to you, as they are new members of our Carleton community, and we're really excited to have them. So Dr. Suzanne Harris-Brandts is an assistant professor in the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism and a faculty associate with the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies here at Carleton. Her research brings together design and social sciences to explore issues of power, equity, and collective identity in the built environment. Susie's current book project, entitled Constructing the Capital, draws from her dissertation uncovering the politics of urban development and image making in Eurasian capital cities. It examines city building campaigns in part democratic, part authoritarian hybrid regimes, foregrounding the cases of Tbilisi, Georgia, and Skopje, North Macedonia. The work demonstrates how architecture and urban design are manipulated for power retention in such regimes, while also highlighting bottom-up community-based strategies to resist these actions. Susie is a licensed architect in Ontario and co-founder of Collective Domain, a practice for spatial analysis, urban activism, architecture, and media in the public interest. And Dr. David Sichinava teaches at the university, in the Faculty of Social and Political Science, as well as the International School of Economics at Tbilisi State University. He's also part-time faculty at the International Black Sea University in Tbilisi, Georgia. Trained as a human geographer, David's research focuses on the social, spatial, and temporal aspects of inequality, the politics of urban development, and the role of civil society in urban policy. His recent publications include chapters for the books Georgia, From Autocracy to Democracy, edited by Jones and McFarlane from U of T Press in 2020, and Urban Activism in Eastern Europe and Eurasia, edited by Daryeva and Neugebauer, Dawn Publishers 2020. David is also a co-founder of Collective Domain and research director of the Caucasus Research Resource Center, CRRC, Georgia, and Tbilisi, Georgia. Just one note before I turn it over to Susie and David is that we will be tape recording this event. So just so you guys know that, and we do have a number of people in Georgia who are by reasons of time, unable to watch. So we're going to put this on our YouTube channel, and we'll be able to get a lot of views, I think, through that. So with that, I'll send it to Susie and David, and we can start the presentation.
So much, Jeff. I'll just share my screen here. Can you all see that?
That's good.
So thanks so much to you all for coming. Before we get started, we wanted to briefly thank those that made this event possible. Thank you to Carleton's Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and the Azrieli School of Architecture and Urbanism for co-hosting the event. It's really great for us to bring these two audiences together to discuss these ideas about history, politics, as they relate to architecture. Special thanks goes to Professor Jeff Sahadeo for the invitation and Leah Rasmussen for her work on the organizational end. We'd also like to acknowledge the Shoto Rustaveli National Science Foundation of Georgia, which funded some portions of this research. And we're really excited to be here and to share with you a bit of our ongoing work about Tbilisi. This is still very much a work in progress, so we'd greatly appreciate any feedback that you might have on its current direction.
So this evening we wanted to share with you the unique story surrounding a building that has captured our imagination for several years now. It's this one here, originally the iconic 1930s Marx, Engels, and Lenin Institute, or EMEL, as it is known colloquially. In 2016, this was converted to the 7-star Biltmore Hotel. As you can see, the original shell and facade of the EMEL building was retained, but they were heavily renovated. And this 32-story glass skyscraper was then added to the back of the building, with both parts becoming the new Biltmore Hotel. So here you can see the layout of the project with the original building in front being turned into hotel lobby and the conference hall, while guest rooms or restaurants are located inside the new skyscraper at the back of the building. And for someone who's interested, here's the detailed floor plan. You can see that original email building in front and the new Biltmore Hotel, the skyscraper on the back.
Initially, our interest in this building began through our sort of broader concerns for the rapid development underway all across Tbilisi. So as you can see here, the past few decades have brought this kind of incredibly rushed construction to the city, especially throughout its historical old core. So for the past 2 years now, we've been working on researching these changes as a part of an NSF grant looking at the social impacts of large-scale urban development. And that's been both in Tbilisi and Georgia's second largest city of Batumi. So our interest in the Email building and its conversion into this Biltmore Hotel sort of evolved alongside that research. It's just one example of the complex socio-political narratives that are caught up in Tbilisi's rapid urban change. And to give you a bit of a sense of the Biltmore Hotel's dramatic presence on the skyline, here you can see how much it towers over the city. It's sandwiched between the river and the city's most prominent historical corridor of Rustaveli Avenue. And we were especially captivated by the kind of iconic nature of this project and wanted to further research its somewhat surprising history. On the surface, the 1938 Email building and 2016 Biltmore Hotel projects seem as though they couldn't be more different or distinctly motivated from one another, despite actually being kind of on the exact same project site. And in many ways, they really are polar opposites. They encompass all that's been dramatically changing from the period of Soviet rule to that of post-independence in the 1990s. Email is this kind of explicitly propagandistic use of architecture, and its design and programming propound the virtues of communism. And as we're going to show you in a bit more detail, it's a socialist classicist design, and it performed as a communist research institute and library. And then by contrast, the Biltmore Hotel is this kind of beacon of opulence, leisure, high-end capitalist consumption, all the sorts of things that embody a 7-star hotel. And it makes its statement in a city that's rapidly globalizing and relying on tourism to bolster the economy. But in reality, as we're going to argue, the two projects have far more in common than may initially seem. So we're going to talk you through some of the fascinating similarities and differences that emerged in the adaptive reuse of the building. We're going to foreground the two sort of what we would call soft power architectural design narratives and the surrounding design politics. The primary politicized soft power design narrative that we're going to focus on in the building is this idea of friendship among nations, friendship between those foreign actors that are initiating the construction of the building and then their local counterparts that are benefiting from the presence in the city. And we see this friendship of nations narrative first in the Soviet constructed Email building, which was the project of Stalin and Beria, and then again, but in new forms, in the Biltmore Hotel, which is this project of top UAE officials and the Georgian government. Now, in both situations, Tbilisi's built environment was shaped in a manner that's beneficial to these foreign interests. But to the broader public, these imposing sort of foreign presences are instead framed simply as welcome friendships. And just to step back a bit to frame this work a bit more theoretically, several historians and scholars of the history of concepts have examined this idea of a kind of rhetoric of friendship among nations. Yevgeny Roshchin's work, for example, tracks its use as one of the most popular concepts in diplomacy, international law, and politics. He concentrates on the history of the British Empire and the foundation of the United States. Conceptually, his work builds on scholars like Carl Schmitt, who famously defined the political as the distinction between friend and enemy. With regards to the Soviet Union, Lowell Tillett's The Great Friendship from 1969 and Terry Martin's The Affirmative Action Empire are two of the most extensive resources. And Professor Sahadeo's own excellent work on the topic with regards to migrants in Moscow and Leningrad is also highly recommended.
So the idea of friendship among nations, I guess. The next one.
Oh, the mouse went wild.
Yeah, that's right. So let's go back to the Soviet idea of the friendship among nations, or as it is called in Russian, Druzhba Narodov. It surfaces perhaps most commonly in relation to nationalities policies, and we can see its impact on across the Soviet Union. As Tillet's work shows, the concept itself was quite flexible, and it was changing over decades of Soviet rule, as the party itself would redefine its approach to nationalist policies. In the Soviet Union, its rhetoric was primarily introduced by Stalin in the mid-1930s. Between 1929 and 1931, the Soviet leadership actually initiated a new campaign designed to foster this brotherhood of the people's notion. This was the roots of friendship of the people, being used as the metaphor to represent, of course, Soviet unity and also the Soviet nation itself. It manifests in everything from official state speeches to the invented traditions of new civic holidays and sports, and of course, arts, including architecture. And it is far less known and far less discussed in terms of which specific ways the idea of friendship between the nations was projected in architecture, in built environment. And we wanted to explore this question in this project. We were especially captivated by the fact that this narrative was expressed by two different regimes, socialist, capitalist, during different eras, while using the exact same building.
It's worth noting that the Soviet narrative of friendship among peoples or nations was, of course, highly idealized and propagandistic. There's no mention of hostility amongst those who constituted the populations of the USSR. Instead, there's only a sense of mutual respect and helpfulness. It's a common struggle against class enemies, both domestic and foreign. And of course, this interpretation runs counter to the accounts of many historians, and it should instead be described as a kind of elaborate historical myth. At its core, it's also a narrative that supports the Marxist view that the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. As this Stalin quote argues, history tells us that the only way to abolish national inequality, the only way to establish a frame of fraternal cooperation between the working masses of oppressed and non-oppressed peoples, is the liquidation of capitalism and the establishing of a Soviet structure. So in other words, it's a kind of view that the popular masses of all Soviet republics are inherently friendly with each other because of their class interests, which are going to eclipse any potential national rivalries.
With specific regard to Soviet expansionism, the impression is given that neighboring peoples saw the growing Russian and Soviet state only as an ally and protector. And there is no hint, indeed, that people might have feared Soviet military power or have been suspicious to the state's motives. And to prove this, we can see here some propaganda posters that support this notion of inter-republican friendship. The one on the left says in Russian, Mir Druzhba, that is peace and friendship. And the one on the right reads, Здравствует Братский Союз, Великая Дружба Народов СССР. In English, it's Hail to the brotherly union and the great friendship of the peoples of the USSR. And notably, if you can notice, these flags also say Привет Великому Сталину, that is, hello to great Stalin. So what about the use of this narrative of a friendship among nations in architecture? Throughout the decades of Soviet rule, it also often made its way into the built environment, and we'll show you some remarkable results, some examples of these. It was supported through the creation of friendship monuments, such as this one at Moscow on VDNH, that's Fountain of the Friendship of Peoples, which was constructed in 1954. This actually comes from Georgia. It's Russia-Georgia Friendship Monument, or Treaty of Georgievsk Monument in Azrieli, Georgia, from 1983. And the monument commemorates the incorporation of the Eastern Georgian feudal kingdom of Kartli under the vassalage of Russian Empire. This is the People's Friendship Arch in Kiev, Ukraine, coming from 1982. And this one is actually outside the Soviet Union. It's the monument of the Bulgarian and Soviet friendship in Varna, Bulgaria, and it comes from 1978. But there are many other similar monuments, and as well as building detailings.
The ML building in Tbilisi very much fits into these kind of narratives. So we're going to start back in time with the friendship narratives in that building before we move on to the contemporary narratives of friendship in the Biltmore Hotel. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the story of Tbilisi's ML building begins not in Georgia, but in Russia. As you can see it depicted here in this paintings, the first Institute of Marx, Engels, and Lenin was established in Moscow in the 1920s. Initially, this Moscow branch served as a kind of local library and an archive. In the 1930s, the Russian Communist Party expanded the Institute's mission to include the study and dissemination of communism among the broad masses, both within and outside of the party. By the 1940s, the Institute in Moscow had reached a really impressive collection, had 400,000 books and journals, as well as over 55,000 documents belonging to Marx and Engels. And then over the years, the Institute even further expanded its mandate to include functions like a research center and a publishing house. And it started to support the highest body of the Communist Party, which turned it into a really crucial component for state propaganda efforts. And then with this Moscow branch as precedent, beginning in the 1930s, it was decided that various other Soviet republics should also have these institutes in their land. In some instances, like Ukraine and Georgia, the new institutes involved kind of amalgamating or replacing existing local ones with more centrally controlled ones that could control their contents uniformity. But by the 1950s, you could find these sorts of institutes all across the Soviet Union, places like Georgia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and even Dagestan.
So it was between 1934 to 1938 that the original Tbilisi ML building was constructed. Its aim was to house the Transcaucasian, that is regional, branch of the Institute. The branch had a few mandates. It prepared the works of Lenin, Stalin, Marx, and Engels for local publication. It studied the history of the revolutionary movement in Transcaucasia, with a specific focus on the role of Stalin in this. And broadly speaking, it was linked to the state's local propaganda activities. The building was designed by the famous Russian architect, Alexei Shchusev, who also designed the Lenin Mausoleum in Moscow on the Red Square. And as you can see, the Tbilisi ML has a giant neoclassical order that also works to convey this power of the Soviet authorities. For example, you can see how these enormous columns span the whole height of the building. It towers over people in the street and makes them feel very, very small in comparison.
Beyond the institution's ideological mandates as this hub of communist doctrine, the architecture itself worked to convey these ideals of communism through the building's detailing. And so, as you can see here, the design was highly symbolic, especially in these facade embellishments on the front facade. And this enabled it to function almost as a means of public service announcement on the outside, while housing the great works of communism within it. The main symbolic areas of the design are these sculptural reliefs, and they were done by famous Georgian artists. And so beyond their maybe perhaps more explicit content of pan-Soviet solidarity, there was even this sense of friendship and solidarity in the sense that a Russian architect was paired with two of Georgia's most famous sculptors. And here you can see that 3-meter high frieze as it still exists today. And the frieze features these 5 different pieces or panels that were done by the Georgian sculptor Tamar Abakelia. And they depict nationally focused moments from communist history or Georgian interpretations of popular communist themes. A kind of common goal that runs throughout them is this idea of uniting people under Soviet control. And the design engendered not only cross-republic friendship, but maybe equally importantly, the sense of subservience to the central leadership and willingness to buy into their power. This was really important because the newly acquired Soviet territories of the 1920s, like Georgia, in many ways needed to be shown reasons for their at time violent conquering by the Bolsheviks. So if we remember that, you know, the Bolsheviks rose to power in the name of against imperial czarist Russian initiatives. So the project was really keen to show that this was something about friendship. It contributed to larger nation and state building campaign. So that was part of the underlying message of this building.
So let's go deep into details. Zooming in on the frieze, we can see these propagandistic friendship narratives. So this is the leftmost panel that shows the workers of Batumi in 1902. So it's a reference to pre-revolutionary protests in Western Georgia in response to the Rothschild petroleum plant's firing of 400 workers. And this strike is actually seen as an early landmark in what later became the socialist revolutionary movement in the South Caucasus. So next to this panel is one for October in Georgia. It depicts reactions of local Georgians to the events of the Russian Revolution in October 1917 in Petrograd, or present-day St. Petersburg. And the inclusion of this and the previous panel worked as a sort of a propagandistic sense to support the argument that Georgia actually had been a willing partner in the forging of Soviet communism. It was an ally and a friend rather than merely a victim of Bolshevism or Bolshevik military expansions. So we have three other phrases here. The next three actually depict common communist themes of worker prosperity. For instance, this one is Georgian industry, this is Georgian agriculture, and a happy communist life. So they communicated the benefits of communism within Georgia through expressions of how Soviet subjects would work together towards friendship and the future that's supposed to be prosperous.
The building's two other primary sculptural reliefs are these 4 by 5 meter entablatures that are on either side. The one on the left commemorates this idea of the unity of the working people, which is represented by a Georgian peasant standing alongside an oil worker from neighboring Baku, Azerbaijan, and Russian workers. And they're carrying the Georgian banner, "Workers of the World Unite." And then the panel on the right symbolizes the worker heroes of the first 5-year plan. And as you can see in both, Stalin is a kind of central figure. And because of this, these plaques were removed off the surfaces of the buildings in 1990. So here you can just see that now they're just blank placeholders. And while the majority of the main frieze, those 5 pieces remained, these cartouches with the busts of Marx, Engels, Lenin, and Stalin were also removed in the 1990s.
So soon after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Lenin Building was repurposed to host other important state institutions, now 4 independent nation-state of Georgia. For example, Imel housed the Parliament of Georgia between 1992 and 1995, and it was the place where members of the parliament voted for the first post-independence constitution of the country. Later on, Imel hosted the country's constitutional court until 2006, when the court was relocated. So the building holds a lot of historic importance. Although in 2007, the entire Ministry of Culture abruptly and single-handedly removed the building from Heritage Building list, where it had been for a while, essentially since 1986. So 1 week later, in a series of corrupt dealings, the building was sold to a Tbilisi-based real estate developer, and shortly afterwards, it also again changed hands, and it was resold to the UAE-based Dhabi Group. So the removal of this building from the National Heritage List and its transfer to a private investor triggered several protest rallies. These were organized by local heritage preservationist groups, like you see here. It's the protest rally from 2009, actually. And people felt really betrayed that this iconic building had been sold off without any type of public consultation.
But still, they went ahead with the redevelopment. As you can see here, the privatization of the building left it first for a number of years just sitting to decay. And many people think or say that that was because it could reinforce an argument that historic preservation would be unlikely, that it would just be too past the point of return. But being a Stalinist classicist building, it was very strong and lasted anyways. But it still opened the door for this dramatic transformation through the new development of the Biltmore Hotel. And here you can just see the starting of the construction of the tower in 2014. So now we'll just transition over to 2016 to discuss how this same narrative of a friendship among nations surfaced in the new Biltmore Hotel, albeit in rather different and unique new forms. So this image shows how the building was starting to be designed and just how much it towered over the context. I think for those who've been to Tbilisi, it really is remarkable how much of an impact it leaves on the skyline. Oh, maybe I lost my notes somehow here. I'm going to just stop my screen share for 2 seconds and restart it. That can work. Sorry, I think there was a software glitch.
Okay.
Close. I think my PowerPoint, sorry, PowerPoint was kind of crashing. I'm going to quickly reopen it because it was frozen. The perils of technology. Let's see if we can get this to work second time around. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, can you, oh, I didn't share the screen.
Sure.
Okay, we'll get there. Can you see that now? Perfect, sorry for that. PowerPoint wasn't cooperating. Yeah, so no sooner had the building been completely constructed in 2016, then workers started covering it in these large white vinyl sheets that went all up the 150-meter high western facade. For anybody at the street like us taking this picture, this was a really bizarre process of trying to figure out what was going on. It had just been built and now it was kind of going back under some form of construction. Everybody wondered what they were doing. And here you can see a kind of window washing machinery being used to apply that white sheeting all up and down the facade. And it was soon revealed that this was all being done as a part of the building's grand opening events. The western facade was going to be used as an enormous video projection screen.
So, and this grand opening was indeed a huge, huge spectacle in the city. So on 31st July 2016, the opening included a dramatic display of fireworks, lights, artistic performances, and speeches. And what we saw in local news outlets was that approximately 5,000 people attended this opening ceremony, and it included distinguished guests such as Georgia's prime minister and other high-profile politicians, as well as prominent foreign officials such as Sheikh Nahyan bin Mubarak Al Nahyan and other members of Emirati royal family. So, using that western facade covered in white foam, the main feature of the event was a digital animation projected onto that building.
And linking back to our main theme of the research, the narrative of that animation was, of course, this sense of a growing presence of strong friendship between Georgia and the United Arab Emirates as the project's developer. And this was really tapping into the fact that new development from the Gulf in Georgia could be witnessed everywhere in the 2000s and early 2010s. As we'll show you in a minute, the friendship was shown in the opening ceremony in this video through things like these juxtaposed images of both countries and their flags. And it's likely that the UAE decided to play up this narrative of a friendship among nations for some of the same reasons as the Soviets. As a large foreign interest arriving in the South Caucasus, they were viewed in many ways by local Georgians with skepticism as somewhat uninvited outsiders. Broadly speaking, in light of all of this rapid development in Tbilisi in the past decade, there's been a lot of ambivalence regarding outside influences through investment, particularly investment that's coming from Muslim Gulf countries, since Georgia's 95% Christian. As a part of our research, we conducted 6 focus groups with residents, and our findings reinforced this understanding of local attitudes. They show that people perceive large-scale investments to be aimed not at locals, but instead at elite foreigners. And in particular, many of our respondents expressed great skepticism with regard to investment coming from the UAE, Iran, or Turkey. And part of that skepticism was because since the mid-2000s, foreign investment in Georgia by the Gulf really has expanded quite exponentially. Right around the time when this project was initially starting to take shape, the UAE was Georgia's top foreign investor, comprising a whopping 20% of the country's FDI. And these investments have mostly been geared towards the real estate sector and particularly tourism and hospitality. In 2007, speaking of a proposal for a possible 3 billion dirham or 800 million US dollar business partnership with the UAE, the Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili called the relationship between Georgia and the UAE a strong partnership in a short period of time.
So the opening ceremony animation of the Biltmore Hotel actually attempts to frame Georgia and the UAE's rapidly forming friendship in an equally rapid period of 8 minutes. So now we will just walk you through some screenshots from the video, and that we thought were very helpful to analyze relative to this theme of friendship. So here you go. As a part of efforts to demonstrate the UAE's benevolence as a rapidly rising foreign power, the Biltmore Hotel actually was literally presented as a gift to Georgia in the opening ceremony. Here you can see a screenshot from the building being digitally unwrapped like a giant present. So, well, of course, still it's worth noting that the arrival of Gulf investments to Georgia in the 2000s followed a very, very different path from that of 1920s Soviet control. Rather than imposed political or militaristic influence, the presence of the UAE in Georgia has so far taken only softer economic forms. It has also been invited by the Georgian government. So here you can see the highlighting of key historical events in Georgia, like the declaration of Georgian sovereignty, the creation of the first parliament of Georgia, and sort of an ambiguous summary of 12th century Georgian culture. As with the Soviet friezes and the original Lenin Building, the content of this animation is very carefully framed. It showcases only select themes from Georgian history and leaves out other parts. In this way, a stronger case was made for why Georgia would benefit from the outside attention of UAE investors. For example, the animation focuses heavily on the famous Georgian poem, The Knight in the Panther's Skin. The protagonist of this 12th century poem is an Arab prince. So through the reframing of history, an argument actually is made for a centuries-old bond of friendship between the South Caucasus and the Gulf.
But the video also misrepresents the current state of the built environment in Tbilisi. So for example, as you're seeing here, only very select and really cartoonish drawings are used to show the image of Tbilisi's existing skyline. And the focus is on the low-rise, deteriorating vernacular buildings that are from the 19th century in the Old City. And that's despite many iconic new works of architecture being across the city in the 2000s. The implicit message is that while Georgia may be successfully independent, it still needs an outside assistance in terms to effective urban development. How the UAE can provide that assistance is then shown through the showcasing of the dramatic city building projects that took place back in the Emirates. And so beginning with a scene of the Gulf against a rather vacant landscape with just a few oil rigs, a dramatic dhow boat appears with the UAE flags, and then the scene rapidly transforms with these new high-rises growing out of the sand in the desert to create the kind of Dubai skyline. In contrast to those flat, cartoon-like renderings of shanty old Tbilisi, the audience now watches as the high-tech computer renderings of new architectural projects in the UAE flash across the screen. So for example, we're seeing a whole series of iconic UAE projects that communicate to the Georgian audience that with Emirati support, they too can benefit from the kind of offshoots of brand Dubai. The audience learns quickly, though, that in Georgia, this isn't going to be a friendship among nations built on equal collaboration and exchange, but perhaps instead one of foreign dependency and support, of a Georgian reliance on the UAE to reach its development goals.
So we'll quickly show you the video. We think that it will be quite something interest and annotate what the video is showing. Maybe just go to minute 1.
Yeah, so it starts with just a kind of countdown till the event opens, and then it starts in the year of the project's beginning, which is 2016. And then it goes way back in history, all the way to the 12th century. And then that's when we see this kind of romanticization of the knight in the panther's skin. There's different stories from across that period. This is that depiction of the old city. And this video is on YouTube if anyone's curious. We can put the link in the chat. And this is the old city growing up. This kind of cartoonish depiction of it. And then this is the history components. And then we switch to the UAE. So this is the boat arriving. And then we see all of that new architecture culminating in the building becoming the present, and then wrapping for everybody. And then there's a grand fireworks display. So yeah, YouTube video might not represent the grandeur of this event, but it was quite something, as the witnesses say. So this message of this UAE coming on to the rescue as a force of modernization lived on past the grand opening events of the Lutmer Hotel. So today, the building actually continues to broadcast this sense of Georgian Emirati friendship by projecting enormous flags from each country on a TV at the top of the building, like you see here. So this is Georgian and Emirati flags. And it is particularly surprising for us that as an independent nation, Georgia would allow its tallest building in the capital to constantly display the flag of another nation. Well, to us, it's a reminder that the pride of the Biltmore project is not really Georgian, but it's largely Emirati. So briefly to summarize, and then hopefully we can just switch over to a bit more of a fruitful open discussion. Our research has been looking at the shifting symbolic narratives of the Biltmore Hotel building in Tbilisi. And we've studied how both the Soviets and contemporary UAE governments have used this narrative of a friendship among nations in architecture to really further their political economic goals within Georgia. Now, for the Soviets, this narrative was used toward the development of communism. And for the UAE, it was used to facilitate the country's attempts to establish itself as a kind of 21st century global superpower exporting brand Dubai. The Soviets relied on urban development to foster comradeship, not for investment purposes, but more for, say, biopolitical governance. They were using architecture to help create the ideal Soviet person. The UAE, by contrast, isn't responsible for governance in Georgia, of course, and it's not even used its influence yet towards any sort of hegemonic or militaristic means. It's been deployed really just as a means of fostering acceptance for its local economic investments. But overall, both of these campaigns kind of underscore the fact that for well over a century, Tbilisi has remained a city that's sort of subject to the development whims of powerful outside actors.
So, more broadly speaking, we think that this work actually raises some interesting questions about the future directions of Tbilisi's urban development. What we see happening today is that the UAE is just one foreign actor that is keen on making a mark on Tbilisi's skyline. And there are many more others, including Turkey and China. And this is quite different from 19th and 20th century, when the city actually was largely influenced by the one-directional presence of imperial and later Soviet Russia. And as a result, the way Tbilisi's skyline is taking form today is much more fragmented and with greater diversity in foreign interests, foreign actors, foreign investments. And just in short, despite Georgian independence, the country is still quite limited in terms of dictating its own urban trajectory. So, and the iconic construction in the capital continues to at least some point to communicate this hegemony of foreign power. So we'll stop now, and we can hopefully have a open up and fruitful discussion. And much thanks for your attention.
Great, thanks, Susie and David. It's a really fascinating presentation, and I enjoyed it, and I've got a list of many questions. But I'm happy to open up to the audience first. I see David's raised his hand, so I will put him on. I guess that's DW, I think. But whoever David Katai is. Oh, there he is, David. Yeah, David, go ahead. And certainly for the rest of the audience, you can raise your hand or type your question into the chat. I'm happy to take questions either way. But David, go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, thank you for a fascinating presentation. I briefly lived in Tbilisi and would walk by that really ugly building every day, and it's fascinating to see how it's kind of been used. I'm talking about the Biltmore, not the old Stalinist. I'm curious, though, in your narrative of Tbilisi's architecture as, as signs of foreign influence, where the more recent development of sites like Fabrica, Rooms Hotel, what Ugulava and the Ajara group have done in reclaiming disused sort of Georgian factory spaces, old historic spaces, the book factory that is now Stamba Hotel. There's these kind of more locally driven moves that are less impositional in some ways. And is there a parallel to that in Georgian history of kind of monumental landmark buildings being as sort of locally driven? And where does that kind of fit into the picture you're kind of painting here of that external force?
Yeah, that's a great question. Do you want to go one by one, Jeff, or what?
Yeah, go ahead.
Thanks so much for your question. Maybe I can start and then you go, or you want to
start?
Yeah, sure,
for sure.
We're both keen to dive.
Yeah.
I think that's a really good point. And, we were talking a little bit about this earlier today. I think one of the main differences between some of these, I guess, for lack of a better term, some more locally driven projects like, say, Fabrica or something, is their scale as well. Is that there isn't the same drive to make them so explicitly iconic in their architectural representation, even though they become sort of iconic in their own way. But I agree that they're all part of a culture of kind of rewriting the place meanings and histories of some of these factors. And I think Fabrica is one where you could see there also being this sort of emulation of post-industrial reuse all around the world, whether it's, this is the constant discussion of Tbilisi being like Berlin or, being even cooler than these places, this weird emulation of any post-industrial creative space that comes out of cities from New York to Amsterdam to Tbilisi and abroad. So I think that there could be an equally rich study of those sort of soft power or influences in design that are imported. And of course, all culture is a kind of blend of local and foreign influences in that sense. In terms of whether or not in the past there was also more locally driven architecture, yeah, I think Tbilisi is a great city for showing that. If you look at like Orbaladze's Wedding Palace or some of the other, many other projects across Georgia, Georgia has a kind of strong history of Georgian architects working. But I think in the particular period of socialist classicism, you know, the first half of the 20th century, we see much more of these restricted projects with a specific narrative, specific style of architecture meant to communicate the party's message.
Yeah, the one thing that I can add to the presence of ideologically kind of laden buildings. I think actually the early Soviet era is pretty interesting in that way, and actually the evidence is quite overlooked, I would say. Of course, Tbilisi doesn't have that much constructivist, that is new, like new Soviet kind of this architecture. There are very few. I would name basically 3 or 4 maximum constructivist buildings. That was actually the most ideologically laden buildings, although they are pretty interesting and had been, for instance, the bread factory, which actually will be renovated by the team of Ugulava and all the Fabrica guys. And I think another question is this reuse of old buildings, old monumental buildings for different purposes. So we can see that more investor and the government-driven reuse, like we saw in case of Biltmore, but we also have the bottom-up reuse of buildings. So for those who are not familiar with the Georgian context, Georgia has a lot of conflict displaced population. Actually, 8% of the country's population was displaced in early 1990s and later than 2008. And in many cases, it's conflict displaced population, IDPs as we call IDPs, actually would in some cases would squat these buildings and actually repurpose them for residential purposes. So we can just see these 2 parallel uses of old Soviet era buildings. So we can see their reuse through in terms of by the investor to make money and for this for capitalistic consumption, and then we see the reuse for just by everyday people to just house themselves.
Other questions now? I have a whole bunch, but maybe I'll ask 2 now. Suzanne, maybe one sort of my first and my last question. So my first question, sort of at the beginning of the process, was obviously when you just look at the images, this is night and day from any other building in Tbilisi. And was there any kind of public consultation or controversy as this building was going up? What was the political atmosphere of it? I also wonder, did it ever become a political football in this time in terms of either the building of it or anything? And then the second part of that question is, after it was built, was it able to stimulate some kind of foreign investment as it was intended to do? We were always wondering when I walked past that building, like, who stays there? Like, what are they doing? Are they negotiating some kind of big deals or something like that? And you mentioned your focus groups. I don't know what people think they're doing there, what they're really doing there, if investment is going in. So.
Yeah, Jeff, thanks so much for these questions. Well, first and foremost, there had been no public consultation when first the building was removed from the heritage list and resold to the investor. And actually, the way people learned about this, it was actually on Georgian, like on an internet discussion board. Like, well, it was 2007 and the golden era of internet forums, you know. And actually, there is the website Tbilisi Forum, which is the Georgian sort of alternative of Reddit. And the first group of protesters actually first kind of waves of protest actually was organized through this discussion board. There were absolutely no public discussion on taking the building out of the list, of the heritage list. And although there, in the follow-up, when the building was sold to Zabi Group, there had been lots of petitions from them, preservationist groups, to bar the investor from basically to take back the status of the heritage building. And one thing that I want to highlight here is that actually the building was left on purpose to demolition. The reason why they retained the old core and shell of the building was that they were not able to demolish that, because it was, well, people say that some specialists, architects and preservationists say that that was the reason why it was retained. So they first left the building on purpose to decay, but it didn't work somehow. And then later, basically they had to renovate the facade of the older shell of the building. What is interesting is that these protest rallies actually were one of the first of its kind in Tbilisi. It basically started in 2009, and it sort of helped to drive the attention of the people, of this general society. And well, it's our other work explores it. Actually was one of the first triggers to reinvigorate the idea of heritage protest movements in Tbilisi, because especially in terms of preserving not the, let's say, 19th century heritage, which is considered as a true heritage, but also Soviet era buildings and Soviet era heritage. In terms of stimulating investments, what I can just say is that there is a casino there, and that's actually, I mean, Georgia has very liberal laws in terms of gambling, and it actually was done to attract basically gamblers, but those who want to go to casino, because many neighboring countries, including Turkey, Azerbaijan, and Armenia, they either completely ban gambling, or it is quite, quite controlled. Same goes for the Gulf countries, and so that was and gambling is actually one of the most profitable businesses in Georgia. Not only, let's say, but Georgians going in gambling, it's not a huge proportion, but actually tourists coming for gambling.
Yeah, so I think when I went inside and was poking around, the majority of the guests are also from the Gulf. I think it's been really heavily advertised overseas as a place to stay if you're coming here, and presented as, you know, quite an opulent destination. On a pragmatic level, it's one of the few larger conference facilities. So they've also been working hard to lure any large conferences that might come there. So it really is this kind of package deal of promoting Tbilisi as a tourist destination for events, as well as kind of high-end guests that want to come from the Gulf. And then, of course, this casino add-on is really appealing to that audience too. It's a kind of particularly more so in Batumi, but also here, this like Sin City vacation, Las Vegas experience in a way.
I was also wondering too what the view from the UAE is. Did they just sort of randomly fall upon Georgia, or was this some kind of courtship from the Georgian government? It's some sort of an interesting relationship that this would be such a massive investment by one country.
My understanding is that Saakashvili was trying to court UAE developers, and that I'm sure there was, from his UNM government, there were several like behind the scenes wheeling and dealings of like I mean, they must have got this building for basically next to nothing. So there's all kinds of extreme trades that go on. And then the UAE also donated in Batumi thousands of palm trees to line the boulevard and have it named after the sheikh.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's, I think one of the attractive sides of Georgia from the kind of UAE's perspective, I think it was kind of relatively cheaper and less regulated real estate market, as well as the potential. I mean, if we talk about other UAE projects, not necessarily about Biltmore, it was also, for instance, the earliest investment was this Rakia group that actually purchased. So as far as I remember, so they established a free trade zone for them. So they definitely had preferential treatment in that stage. And also next to that, it was basically Georgian government's, like focus on FDI-driven development, which was basically the main mantra, which actually has been the main mantra of Georgian development since during the last 20 years, I would say. So it's like easy money, but well, this form.
Okay, so so Mariana had this question here. So in your opinion, what was the biggest challenge in the building conversion?
Great, thanks, Mariana. That's something that's interesting to think about for us. I think some of it is not necessarily in the process of conversion itself, but just with the fact that the people who had purchased this site were stuck with a project that they really didn't want. I imagine that the developers, if they could, would have wanted to clear it completely off and build this opulent hotel. So they had to instead deal with something that had completely opposite ideology and totally different use. They were going from an archive and research center to a 7-star hotel. And some of that was negotiated by turning, say, the auditorium into some of the conference facilities. And some of it just was kind of completely subverted. Or there's still a really odd sense that because the building was a neoclassical building, it's opulent and nice from that time, being subverted now into like the opulent entrance of a 7-star hotel. So I think some of the hardest parts were in just dealing with reconciling these narratives, but they definitely were not light-handed with the renovation. They demolished almost the entirety of the interior. There was all kinds of very beautiful artifacts and documents too. All of the library, it was shown that employees were stealing things, perhaps maybe even because they didn't trust that they would be relocated to better locations. So maybe like renovation is even a generous term. They kept basically the core shell and what had this sort of literally facade appearance of marble or opulence, and then the rest is really just scraped clean, and then this tower added in the back. So it's really an odd one to think about when you're forced to renovate something rather than you have this desire to use it to your advantage.
Just to add, but I think that Jeff was asking about the stakeholders. Do the stakeholders also participate, or definitely the community?
No. Yeah, so this was done at a time in Georgia, right when it was the kind of really wild west of development. So the huge corruption associated with it. It was on the heritage list from the Soviet times, really quickly removed from that list just to be sold ever so conveniently to private investors. And then all of this started to happen. So any of the heritage preservation efforts came from really remarkable and important on-the-ground urban activist movements that spent many, many days not only physically being there in person, but researching all of this stuff and debunking all of the laws that had been short-circuited. So a lot of the credit to the fact that the original building exists there at all, I think, goes to those urban activists that did this tremendous job of kind of educating the public and revealing what was going on. Yeah, thanks so much for the question.
So Leah has a question. Thank you so much for your talk. I just wondered how the development of this project and its impact on the Tbilisi skyline has helped conservation efforts of similar style buildings, there's a push to preserve this heritage more, or does the investment continue to triumph?
Great question. Yeah, and I think especially Soviet buildings are kind of double-edged sword with that one, where some of them are really keen to be preserved, and then some of them less so. So I'll just anecdotally name a couple from my own research. So I was interested in the cable car buildings alongside our other research partner, David Govishvili, and some of those are also the Academy of Science is this dramatic Soviet socialist Stalinist, era building just a little bit further down the street, and in its courtyard is a cable car building that many people were hoping would be reactivated, and there's then they were going to build a new one. So yes, I think some of these cases are increasing heritage preservation, but it's sort of a new thing that Soviet heritage is valued. The older, I think any of this classicist Stalinist era stuff, maybe, and it was already on the list. But stuff from the 1970s or even 60s, 70s later is taking time for people to appreciate it. But maybe also you want to touch on Skeltuvo and how that's...
I think it's important to look at the, how these buildings might be perceived from the ideological perspective. So there had been a lot of discussion, usually like early 2010s, I would say like late 2009, right after the Russia-Georgia war, that what should on the desovietization, right? And for some people, these Soviet-era monumental buildings actually, for some people, they were perceived as the remnant of like, let's say Soviet occupation, as they call it. Right? So therefore, their preservation of Soviet-era buildings also had ideological dimension, right? So you're getting this hard past of the Soviet-era occupation. So therefore, it's better just not to retain them. So that was the talk. Although our focus groups actually showed that people do not have that sort of opinion. I mean, they actually value in the Soviet era architectural heritage. I mean, there were like some interesting quotes. So, people weren't that happy of Soviet era mass housing, so-called Khrushchevkas. These are like the low ceiling, like 5 or 6 story kind of buildings. People weren't that happy of that, but they were saying that, okay, why should not we retain the, for instance, Email building or the Ria Vostoka building or the Academy of Science building? So these are the 1920s, 1930s Soviet era buildings. And they were very much in favor of retaining them and recognizing them as a heritage. So there is definitely this undercurrents that sort of explain the situation there.
Yeah, I think it's changing, especially because many of them have had those, like the hammer and sickles, the stars, and Stalin removed from them. So then the buildings are starting to evolve with new narratives on them.
And I did wonder, going back to your, and there's one time for one more question after this, which I'll ask if nobody else asks, but if anybody wants to ask a question, get one in now before we end. But I did want to ask when you talk about the friendship of nations or this sort of foreign presence, of course, what's not there was the West in your talk, right? Which was, and I remember when I first went to Georgia in 2000, I guess it was 2009, it was right after the war, but you still saw all the NATO flags, EU flags and things like that up there. And has that, either for the government or the people or both, is there some realization that we just can't rely on the West anymore? Or is there a shift, or is it just a practical thing that the UIE was willing to put money there, and so let's just take it where we can?
Yeah, great question. I would say the latter, that this is a bit what we were starting to touch upon, that it's becoming less unidirectional in terms of the forces, or even polarized in the sense of the Cold War forces of, Russia and then the West showing its presence and things like NATO or this or that. I mean, there's still, especially during that era, there was a ton of influence, so that the corridor from the airport to the downtown is named after Bush. There's a statue to Reagan in Rike Park. And I would say, whenever there are redevelopment projects, you might see like Council of Europe flag on things. The Peace Bridge itself was showcasing the Council of Europe flag. So yeah, there's the city line in many ways has just become this huge political communication device in all its forms, and it becomes this kind of cacophony at a certain moment of this building trying to represent this foreign interest, this one representing a different foreign interest. And I think the thing that we're trying to underscore and make sense of now is just like, at the end of the day, what does that mean for a livable city and the environment you're left with for a city? Some of them can be very positive and necessary. Some of them might be awful, but whether or not they kickstart other development is harder to track and trace. And so it creates, I would say, yeah, this like real fragmented cityscape. But I wouldn't say that there isn't an interest in the West. It just hasn't been happening to the same degree. I don't know if you want to say, or not by foreign investors in this sort of sense.
Yeah, that's absolutely a fair point. I wouldn't say there is a sort of a frustration and like reorientation, let's say, on the UAE or China. So these actors actually had been present here from mid-2000s. So it was not perhaps for, let's say, to respond to the frustration from the West, but it was sort of a diversification of investments from different countries. And the goal was not to look at the origin of investments, but just get as much as possible. So that was sort of an idea. And to be fair, actually, not many large-scale investments from the West, neither from the European Union nor the States, had been there apart from the purely developmental fields, right? Through the donor organizations, but not that much in terms of, let's say, like pure business investments.
Yeah. Maybe just to wrap up then, I wanted to ask also about, if you when you look at your focus groups and look at the trajectory of Tbilisi architecture, is there a lot of sympathy or a lot of money potentially for, and there's still a lot of buildings in Tbilisi that are in pretty bad shape right now. And I don't know what the economics are of restoring them, who's looking into that, if people are leading the effort in that, if there's some kind of national conversation or realization that this is important architecture to preserve, or do you see a lot of these buildings just being torn down at some point and being replaced by more of these UAE, maybe not built more scale buildings, but something new?
I would say overwhelmingly history is being erased and torn down, and it's a big concern for many people. And the earthquakes of the past have only exacerbated excuses for that. The main campaign to repair the old city after the initial Soviet campaign to do so was led by the UNM government, as well as this kind of new life for old Tbilisi, which took on various phases. And on the surface was, promising that there was a dedication of funding towards looking at that, but huge amounts of corruption tied to that as well. Often people that were supposed to be doing work for the New Life for Old Tbilisi campaign were actually out lobbying for the UNM. This is some of the charges were put against Mayor Ugalava for this and the government more broadly. So in any of these efforts, it hasn't been one that you would say, oh, that's doing a great job. So we need more of that. But I would again underscore all of the tremendous work by activists to make sure that some of these places are recognized and get the credit that they deserve. Like Gudiashvili Square, maybe you want to talk a bit about that as one of the positive case studies that came out of all of these activists.
The activism, urban activism, has been quite active since, basically starting from the email cases, like from 2009, and actually that really helped to reinvigorate public interest towards urban heritage. And actually, these activists worked a lot, like online or through protest rallies, to sort of make citizens think about the role of urban heritage. From the practical perspective, I mean, the historical city core still gets renovation. For instance, old life, new life for old Tbilisi is one of the examples. And there had been sort of reorientation of these to the left bank of Tbilisi, where there are like 19th century, like the quarter. So there are like certain areas on which the government kind of tries to invest and take lead, but indeed these areas are also prone to gentrification. But for other cases, for other areas of old Tbilisi, what we see is that many places yet are left for deterioration, and there is a like interesting dynamic in terms of like how local population thinks about these assets, and plus how the developers are kind of responding to this situation on the market. So they sometimes wait to deteriorate for a building, so to make sure that it's not kind of worth in terms of as a heritage building, and then they are able to to build a new building there and make profit out of it. And yeah, that's the kind of sort of the trend that we can see in Greece right now.
Perfect, great. Well, we reached our time, and Zoom fatigue is a thing, as we all know. But I have gotten a couple of private notes to me in the chat just to tell from the audience, just to thank you guys for the talk, and I thank you too, and on top of all of us. It was really fascinating event, and hopefully gives a good introduction to Susie and David, and welcomes them to Carleton. And many of you will be watching this various times, as it'll be on our YouTube channel pretty soon. And so I look forward to continuing the conversation and having more discussion about not just Tbilisi, but about these various different cities and the friendship of nations and foreign investment and all these other fascinating things you brought up. So thanks to everyone, and keep in touch with us through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, all our channels for our next events.